Well, Nancy and I are going to circle the airport a little bit while Mike joins us. It looks like he's trying to get on right now. Let's see. I know we have some people waiting, my computer said. So whoever you are who's watching, welcome. And I hope you're enjoying the book, or at least the discussion. I don't know if how many people are actually reading it, but people can enjoy the discussion and what we're talking about without having to read the book. Let's see. Looks like Mike's trying to get on. I'll remove it until he is on. Nancy, you said you've not read much of Tozer.
Right, but I am enjoying this book. I think that it is, the concepts are ones that we can identify with.
Mm-hmm.
And they carry out themes that are familiar to us, I think. And so I'm enjoying the book. And as I told you earlier, plus there's short chapters. I love short chapters.
Yeah, there you go. We know the real motive now. It's
right.
Mike, welcome. Good to have you here.
Hello.
We were having a little trouble getting you on, so I'm glad you made it.
Me too.
Persevered.
There you
go. Which would be a good Tozer word, right? Perseverance.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to jump right into this because we've got a lot of ground to cover in a half hour. And I want to welcome those of you who are participating, and be sure and chat in if you've got some insights or thoughts. But I want to begin with a theme scripture tonight, Mike and Nancy, and those of you in our audience, from Matthew chapter 16, beginning with verse 23. This is right after Peter has made his great confession about who Jesus is, the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus begins to tell them that he's got to be crucified. And Peter takes him aside and rebukes him over that. And verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." This is one of the great dramatic turns from penthouse to prison, as far as what someone did. He excelled all of them, and then within a few minutes, he was being rebuked by the master. And "Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it." So I find it interesting that the famous verse of "whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves" comes right after Peter rebuking Jesus over Jesus' poor theology, Peter thought, and Jesus rebuking Peter and saying, you don't care about the thoughts of God here, the concerns of God, but only human concerns. So it strikes me, Nancy, that right off the bat, this context is one of the things we have to not denied and to take up our cross is even our wrong interpretations, how we think about things. And of course, the Jewish person thought the Messiah would be this conquering military person who would overthrow the Romans, reinstate the Davidic kingdom. And that, I find it interesting that that's the context of Jesus saying, you must deny yourselves and take up the cross. What do you think about that?
I always think of those verses as denying yourself, which is a wonderful lead-in for what we're talking about with Tozer, and denying yourself of those things that are unimportant. Take up your cross, just like Jesus did on his way to his crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a significant, this is important. We just don't take up our cross for something minor. We take up our cross for the important things. And what could be more important than following the Lord?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, on Mike, on page 12, Tozer says, I think I've got it up here. Yeah. Tozer says the way to deeper knowledge of God is through the lonely valleys of soul poverty, giving up all things. So this idea, and we talked about struggles in different small groups, but I know in our men's group, we've talked about it quite a bit. The way to deeper knowledge is through the lonely valleys of soul poverty, giving up of all things. Mike, how does our attitude about the struggles of life, and all of us have them, but how's our attitude about those struggles impact our growth in this deeper knowledge that Tozer talks about?
Attitude. Well, I mean, your attitude is usually, so your attitude is either driven by your own personal wants and desires, or somewhere else that you place your focus, right? Or God in this instance.
Yeah. So so let me push this a little bit. In other words, the struggles of life, if we find them always devoid of God, we don't think about God working in the midst of it, we're just reacting to them. Is it possible that we really, as human beings, don't really grow in that process? That part of the growth is also accepting that even whether God causes it or not, God's in it, in the midst of the struggle, fine-tuning us, purging us, developing us, growing us. So is that attitude pretty central, do you think, in the scripture narrative to being able to allow those struggles to create growth?
Well, it has to be, right? Because if you don't have the right attitude, then you won't be open. So the struggles ideally help you take that the idol that you put into the middle of your heart and remove it and put God there, right? And help put more of God there and displace the things you've put in place of it. And we don't do that when we're doing really well. We do that when we're struggling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we need something more than we have. We can't just rely on Mike because everything's going good. I need something else, or I need somebody else to help me get through it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
You know, I think too that the attitude that you have in your struggles, if it's an attitude towards what is the Lord helping me or wanting me to learn, then that changes everything about your struggle. And you look at it from a more positive growth perspective.
Yeah.
Is it true also, the Nance?
Oh, Mike's frozen.
Mike, you're frozen. I'm sorry. But Nancy, well, Mike's getting unfrozen. I think of Rick Warren's statement that this world, this earth that we're in, is dress rehearsal for the next. And so if we can look at it like that the struggle is actually a part of fine-tuning us for the next realm, it kind of changes our attitude about it.
It does. And I love that quote, because I think that, so often people say to you, well, go for the gusto. You only have one life, blah, 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 blah. When the reality is, Rick Warren is saying just the opposite. This is not just one life. This is preparing you for the next. Take advantage of that.
Yeah, indeed. What do you think he means by soul poverty? When Tozer says that through the lonely valleys of soul poverty and giving up of all things, what do you think that means?
Well, when I think of the word soul in this context, I think of spiritual things. Mm-hmm. And when I think of poverty, I think of the lack of things, the lack of wealth, the lack of something else. So I think what Tozer is talking about is it's almost like having a spiritual clean slate. You're spiritually have a clean slate so you can start working on the things of God. And if you didn't have soul poverty, a clean slate, you couldn't do that, or at least not as effectively.
Right. Yeah, Mike, you may have heard we're talking about what did Tozer mean by this soul poverty, and I also wonder if it has to do with when you think of poverty. At least I think of in terms of dependence upon someone helping, and soul poverty kind of goes along with Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And I think because the poor in spirit are those who understand their impoverishment of soul without Christ. And so we're less likely to allow the fillers of the world to be a false security and a false food, because our real need is for the manna, Jesus, the bread of heaven. Thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, I was struck by that poverty, that statement as well. And then after that, when he talks about the poor in spirit, he says they've reached an inward state paralleling the outward circumstances of the common beggar in the streets of Jerusalem. That was really, I was really trying to understand what he was meaning there. So, poor in spirit have an inward state that looks like the beggars on the streets of Jerusalem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming the beggars on the streets of Jerusalem have no way of caring for themselves. They're totally dependent on someone else. Is that it?
I think that's part of the image, yeah, that they're dependent upon the mercy and grace of others because they have no power. In ancient Palestine, to be poor was to be powerless. Nancy, looked like you were going to weigh in on something.
Well, just to me, it's just the emptiness of it all. If you're in poverty, you're not full, you're empty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes when it comes to things of the Lord, you have to go through that to get to the better place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have to, yeah.
This chapter is called The Blessedness of Possessing Nothing. And it's interesting his use of Abraham and Isaac. This has been a story that it's so visceral in people's reaction to it. No matter what angle you approach it from, it seems like all of us, if we read it honestly, there's some level of a visceral reaction to this. I mean, this is it's a dramatic story, and there are different takes on it, ranging from some just thinking it shouldn't even be lifted up. It's a story of abuse, and to others seeing it as really the expression of covenant. And that's how I tend to lean, that God was taking Abraham's willingness to give his son as a part of the covenant expression that he would be willing to give his only son for us. Tozer takes a different take on it, even that I'm not sure. I probably have thought of it, but not to the degree that he has. He says on page 15, he says, after this great test, where God then stays the hand of Abraham, stops him from slaying Isaac, which he seemed willing to do. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham expected for God to raise up Isaac from the ashes, so that he fully expected to do it. But he also believed God was going to raise him up as a child of promise. Tozer says, after this great test, Abraham was still wealthy and greatly blessed. No, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry. But I'm still on page 15. Tozer suggests that God never intended for Isaac to be sacrificed. Well, we pretty much agree with that, I think. But God just wanted, and here's the part I want you to think about and respond to. God just wanted to remove Isaac from the temple of Abraham's heart so that God would be unchallenged there. What do you think, Mike, of the author's interpretation as to God's reason for this sacrifice?
I love it. Actually, I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, and to me, that's the first explanation that I've heard that didn't make God seem somewhat capricious.
Mm, mm,
Right? Well, I have to test Abraham to make sure he loves me this much. I have to test Abraham because of the
mm,
covenant and make sure he
mm,
pays me this much.
mm.
Right? All the other ones were very God focused.
Yeah.
God was getting something out of it. And this is the first explanation I've heard where God knew that Abraham had built Isaac into an idol. He had an unhealthy. He had put Isaac in the center of his heart, and that was
Mm,
unhealthy for both of them. And he couldn't. And so all of this was to 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 rectify that, right?
mhm, mhm.
So I to me that's worth reading the whole book just to get that one piece that really connects the whole everything he's trying to say to me with that story.
Yeah.
And the fact that he uses the word temple
Yes.
puts an added emphasis on it, because we don't use the word temple lightly.
Mhm.
Right.
And, this was a total, just like Mike, this was a total revelation for me too, because I've always thought of the story of Isaac as one of obedience and faithfulness. But the way Tozer's take on it is a one of growth and allowing room for the Lord and getting rid of all that other stuff. And I think that's a real powerful way to think of it.
Now, this is probably
yeah.
at least the third time, and maybe the fourth, that I've read this book. And I hadn't remembered this part of it. There are other sections that I've remembered, and the third chapter, I think it's called Beyond the Veil, has always been meaningful to me. The gaze of the soul in one of the future chapters been meaningful. But I'd forgotten about this. And this is a pretty challenging, powerful take on it that cuts to the root of some things that I'm not sure as moderns, 21st century folks, we're as comfortable and familiar with thinking in these terms.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what he's going to push us to do. So after this great test, Tozer says Abraham, basically, to paraphrase, he was still wealthy. He was greatly blessed. Yet, he says this, yet he had everything but possessed nothing. What do you think that means? He had everything, yet possessed nothing.
I love the way he says possess, and he uses that in the title too, right? Or in the book, possessing, right? So that's the issue, isn't it? That we want to possess things, me, mine, I own it, right? And that's the whole thing God's talking about here. And ultimately, it's not things. It's ultimately we want our own will, we want our own control. Right? And by possessing things, we exert our will and our control.
Yeah, and I find it a liberating statement. He had everything. And so it's not as though God didn't want him to enjoy the wonders of all of this, but God didn't want it to be an idol to him. He didn't want him to be possessed by it. So there's that fine line between thinking we possess and truly being free to enjoy, and what we have to go through sometimes in order to reach that place. What idols have to be destroyed in us in order to come to that place.
And you have to come to the place where you understand that the things you possess aren't the important things, and they don't really matter in the end.
Right. Yeah, they're dressing, they're nice things, but none of them are central things.
No.
Jesus said to Martha, only one thing's necessary.
Right.
Only one essential. Everything else is just, just additives. It's nice. But it's not required. Now, Tozer said this, this possessive clinging to things is one of the most harmful habits in life. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. And I think sometimes that you hear stories about how people will do things that are harmful to them because they won't let go of their possessions. I have heard people say they may need to move and go into a smaller house or to a independent living situation, but they don't want to give up their stuff. They don't want to get rid of things, and that's very harmful to you in the long run. And then I think sometimes too we can cling to things in ourselves and cling to ourselves, and that can be very harmful too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mike, it seems that we have this tendency to make idols of things.
Really?
Including ourselves.
And that's what I was going to say. In the garden narrative, it's making an idol of yourself. And so the centrality of the gospel's message to take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. I'm reading a book also this month by Elton Trueblood. And he wrote this in the 1960s. And he's talking about how irrelevant the church has become to the world, that even though superficially it looks great, he said essentially it's appealing only by adopting the methodology of an entertainment society, but requiring or demanding no inward change of people's lives, to paraphrase him. I thought, wow, it's similar in spirit to what Tozer's talking about.
We don't measure church success in people who have deeply committed themselves to Christ. We measure it in attendance.
Absolutely.
It's not money.
And money, right? Yeah, and giving, right.
When I talk to people that maybe I've just met or I'm introduced, and they're Christians and from a different community or whatever, it's not long into a conversation where I'm going to venture a guess of 80% of the time I'm asked the question, so how large is your church?
Oh.
We're fixated with that. And I suppose part of the reason is it's hard to measure spiritual depth. It's easier to measure, is God really moving, by the numbers? Mm-hmm. But, maybe the question we should ask now, how many of the people in your church are comfortable with exorcising demons from people? Well, I'm guessing it would be a pretty low number, right?
Right.
How many of them do you see that are truly living in some sort of sacrificial way, or just the different things that we might characterize as Christian growth? That's awfully hard to measure, but you can measure numbers. You can measure money, and you can measure numbers.
Yeah, because I like to be able to say that I go to a big church.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Mm-hmm. And so that in itself is one of the things that God, it seems like to me, would strip from us and has become an idol to us. Even that vernacular that has to be challenged in what we consider important and necessary and of value. Maybe that's the word. What do we consider truly valuable in our Christian experience? Mm-hmm. So in his pretty dramatic conclusion, Tozer asserts, he says, the ancient curse, and he's talking about, I think, the curse of fallenness and selfishness. The ancient curse will not go out painlessly. The tough old miser, this is page 16, the tough old miser within us will not lie down and die, but must be torn out of our heart like a plant from the soil, expelled from our soul as Christ expelled the money changers from the temple. If we would indeed know God in growing intimacy, we must go this way of renunciation. So my question is, generally speaking, Nancy, do 21st century Christians use different words for this same process of renunciation, or is this process described by Tozer pretty foreign to us?
I think what's foreign to us is I think we take God and we try to cram him in our hearts with everything else. And we don't get rid of those things that are not of God. And so I think that what Tozer is telling us is to make significant change, you need to be doing some exercising of some of the things that are in your heart, some of the idols that are in your heart. And don't just do like I think we do, which is cram God in with everything else.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to Tozer's last week's discussion, God and. That God's just one of the many things that we try to give him top billing
Yes.
in a marquee that's filled with lots of stuff.
Uh-huh. And I think churches do that too, because we oftentimes, instead of doing the things that truly point us towards God, we'll add programs or we'll add ministries to keep up with the other churches.
Yeah. Well, because people are checking us out.
Right.
And you got to have something for everyone in order for people to want to be a part.
Yes. Everybody does it.
I mean, the pressure, and then you get a building and you've got a debt on a building, and so you can end up getting motivated. You want bodies in the pew. Yeah, we want them to grow spiritually, but we also want their money. I'm not describing us, but there are churches like that,
Yes. Or churches that spent, and I don't mean to be bad-mouthing churches, but sometimes you get so involved in the cosmetics of it, being the cosmetics of the music or the sound system or the what kind of flowers we have, and it really it's cramming God in with everything else.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Doyle asked a question. So how would our church change if we follow more closely what Tozer suggests? Good question. What do you think, Mike? How would our church change if we followed more closely what Tozer suggests?
Well, don't you think by losing our desire, by putting aside, by killing our desire to possess things, that would open us up to be more outward focused and giving and loving to others in the community, in need, in whatever you might say, right?
Yeah. And I wonder, related to that, if any church that tries to become more honest in this process, I think the questions that we put on the table become more honest and they start changing. And everything goes on the table. What if? And do we really need this? And what is the one main thing that's central to everything we do? Because we can become so preoccupied with the peripheral and with the details and the tyranny of the urgent that need to be addressed, that we can forget the primary focus of what we're about. So probably the honest questions that we would lay out, and do we feel like, and maybe the process of discernment, where it's not just we come in and we talk about it intellectually and we vote about it, but a more genuine time of clarity of the Spirit to truly get, here's what I think we're to be about. And it would allow us to do some radical things that feel normalized by the Spirit, because a consensus is, I think this is what we're to do, because we've gained that over a period of weeks and months, this clarity. I think that'd be part of it. Nancy, any thoughts? And it's a great question.
I think
how would it change
that those kinds of reflection are, I think that lots of times those kinds of questions really lead to individuals thinking about that for themselves. You know, why do I go to this church? What do I want that is going to lead me closer to God? And there was a book, was it called The Simple Church or The Authentic Church or something like that? And it really talked about those things, getting down to the root of why you exist and as a church, and how you carry out that mission in the most simple, authentic way, and declutter from everything that's going on in the world around us. Now, obviously, that would be a huge, huge change.
Well, you know, I don't know if you've ever read the book In His Steps by Sheldon, but it was written in the late 1800s, I think. And it's a fictitious book, but its premise is what led to the what would Jesus do wristband, craze and all, which is interesting to me too, that we found a way to market that, but that really wasn't his intent, I don't think. But if you've read it, you find that it creates upheaval. I mean, here you've got an editor of a newspaper who refuses to report on a championship boxing match because he doesn't think Jesus would glorify that. Wow. Everyone wants to read about this in the sports section. So it's like crazy. What are you thinking?
Yes.
And it's like turning the tables over at the temple. It creates upheaval. And, you know, it takes the Spirit pulling us into that renunciation to be able to endure that kind of upheaval and to continue the course. Because that's hard. It totally goes. We talk about going against the current of the world. It's hard to go against the current of the religious hierarchy, against just religiosity. Don't you think?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Wow, good stuff.
And you see in the church hierarchy, you see all of the bureaucracy that's of the world, and you have to go, okay, what is this saying?
I know
It's the bark, Nancy. The bark.
Oh, the bark.
Bark on the tree, right?
The bark on the tree. That's exactly right. Somehow God still uses it, as
Yes.
as Eugene Peterson says. And, we can only control the controllables. And the thing that we can offer is our own heart. Okay, Lord, what's this look like for me? What are you calling me to do? And these really hard things help me to be pulled through it. Rees Howes would use an expression, I think. He was coal miner who was converted in the late 1800s and he died in 1950, I think, or 50s. But Rees Howes Intercessors is an amazing book, and he would talk about God. I think he would say God would pull me up or pull me through, and because God would ask him to do some things that societally were just odd, and yet there was a reason. God was helping him to gain a foothold and gain ground in faith that would allow him then to be used for God to channel some miraculous things through him.
And you see that in several of our small groups where you see people that are honestly trying to work through their struggles and grow closer to the Lord. And I think that is truly God using people and helping them so he can use them. And I think that's the great thing about the church today.
Yeah. God always helps us where we are, As Lewis would say, you can't be where you're not, or something like that. We are where we are, and that's where God's going to meet us.
Yep.
I want to close with Tozer's prayer, and I'm going to drop the thous and the these. But he closes his chapter with this prayer, and I want to close with this tonight. Father, I want to know you, but my coward heart fears to give up its toys. I cannot part with them without inward bleeding, and I do not try to hide from you the terror of the parting. I come trembling, but I do come. Please root from my heart all those things which I have cherished so long and which have become a very part of my living self, so that you may enter and dwell there without rival. Then you will make the place of your feet glorious. Then shall my heart have no need of the sun to shine in it, for you will be the light of it, and there shall be no night there. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
That is a powerful, powerful prayer.
It is.
Yes,
Beautiful
it is.
prayer.
Yes. Well, Nancy and Mike, thank you. What a challenging, penetrating chapter this is, chapter 2. So thanks for helping me unpack it. And those of you who are watching and those of you who will watch, God bless you. And go with God, and God will go with you. Good night.
Good night.